Okay, so anybody from Chicago? Okay, has anybody been to Millennium Park? Okay, it's a cool place, really cool place. So what we're going to be talking about now, this is not a project I had anything to do with, but this is a project I love because one of my personal design muses, Pete Adolf, was intimately involved with it. And I really enjoy his work. But this site has such an interesting history. So you'll notice that this is Lake Michigan here, Lake Michigan here. So we are right up against the water in this site. And when this site was first conceptualized, one of the things that the designers wanted to do, again, as they were attempting to figure out what's the story, what are we doing here? Like that's literally, if I could boil it down, as a designer in a little conference room, you're sitting around staring at all the other people in your firm and you're like, what are we doing here? Well, the design intent would have been for the space that we're going to be focusing on, which is this little space down here in the bottom called the Lurie Garden. What are we doing here? And if you look in the constraints, it's a very unique constraint. They were asked to build a garden on top of a parking deck. So one of the things but this idea of building things on top of things in this part of Chicago is not all that new, because while these sort of Midwestern prairies and wet meadows may have existed on this site pre-European settlement, this is what this site looked like in 1960. So this is the Lurie Garden site down here. Here we are again. This is the Lurie Garden site. This is parking on the right. That's all parking. And this is a rail yard here. Okay, but before 1960, you guys may know there was a big fire in Chicago in 1871. And when you have a big fire and the whole city burns down, what you gonna do with all that trash? What you gonna do with all those burnt buildings? Well, they tried to kill two birds with one stone at that time because this site was really wet. It was constantly sinking. And so they tried by hook or crook to raise this area up. And one of the ways that they did that was they took all the debris from the Chicago fire and they dumped it along the shores of Lake Michigan. And the Lurie Garden is essentially this site. Millennium Park and the Lurie Garden is the home of a lot of debris from the 1871 Chicago fire. But, not necessarily a place that you want to go and take a walk with your kids in 1960. But you remember me talking about partie diagrams, okay? So if we were to look at the site that became the Lurie Garden, if we looked at it in 1960, and we wanted to do a really simple partie diagram of what is it, it's parking and railroad. And they're kind of a weird yin-yang thing going on there, parking and railroad. So remember that pattern, because it's going to come up again. It's going to come up again right here. So, GGN, which is Guthrie, Gustafson, anybody remember the last G? Oh, G, no, N, North. Anyway, I can't remember. I should, but I can't. That was the firm. They're a landscape architecture firm out of Seattle, and they won the right to design the Lurie Garden on top of the parking lot. Woohoo! And so they did what my little team did at NC State. They drew and they sketched and they sketched and they crumpled things up and they threw it in a trash can, constantly trying to come up with a pattern that was going to define the layout for the Lurie Garden. And one thing that you keep seeing that is kind of inherent to all of these is this line right through there, which is the line, this one here, 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 here. What's that line from? It's the old bifurcation between the parking lot and the railroad yard. So they kept that because they felt like that, even though there probably wasn't a lot of design that went into deciding which was parking, which was railroad, it was just the way it was, they decided to honor that with their conceptual diagrams of the garden itself. And there you can see they've honored that with this pedestrian boardwalk that essentially bifurcates. This was rail yard, this was parking, this was rail yard, and this was rail yard, this was parking. And they went even further and they conceptualized the garden as one. Part of the fundamental inspiration was that prairie that we saw, the wildflowers, the incredible wildflower diversity in the Midwest, a lot of which comes from these plants that are native to these Midwestern prairies. But also, they decided that they were going to literally thematically separate the two. I call it the rail yard and the parking lot. The rail yard and the parking lot. And one side is going to be a little bit more kind of like, I guess I would say human scale. A walk amongst the trees. That's the dark plate on the right. More ordered paths, human scale. When I say human scale, what I mean by is when you are standing underneath the sky, it's a little overwhelming. When you are standing underneath a tree, you feel there's a space that's carved out for you. That's what we call human scale. When you design streetscapes, typically speaking, that's why places use trees that are more mid-canopy trees, maples, etc. in streetscapes, because they don't feel like a willow oak that's 100 feet tall. And they're also a lot easier than low-story trees and mid-story trees. They're a whole lot easier to accommodate in designs too. So, and then slowly but surely, that design morphed into some really interesting plant collections. This light plate on the left-hand side, which is much more focused on this history as a Midwestern wet meadow or prairie site. They kept along this boardwalk here that cuts through the middle. There's a runnel that moves water through that site. So we kept this idea of moving water, the relationship with water from the lake nearby. And then these screens, I'm not sure that they quite do him justice. I tried to shove a picture of Pete Adolf in there and not obscure some of his amazing planting plans. But Pete is one of my muses. That's why this project is in here. Because a project that I'm going to mention in a minute, the prairie that I worked on at Duke Gardens, this idea of the dynamic landscape. Pete Adolf from the Netherlands, landscape designer, most famous for his incredible planting plans, is kind of in the school of what we would call dynamic landscape designers, in which they're using so many plant species, so intricately tied together in the landscape, meant to grow together, into which it's almost impossible to discern one plant from another, with the idea that it evokes this. There's actually on my webpage, my homepage on my website is a Pete Adolf quote. It's basically like you look at this landscape and it reminds you of something in the genes, nature, or the longing for nature. That is the design intent of all of Pete Adolf's designs. And that sort of statement of his resonated with me as a designer, and I said, that's kind of how I want to design too. So incredibly intricate, diverse planting schemes. Here's this perennial plant in the top left. Here's this crazy idea of a salvia river. So it's this collection of different perennial salvias that run through the entire site. So it's a purple river in the middle of summer. And then all of his the bulb plantings, tons and tons of alliums. It's incredible. If you ever go there, this place is just freaking bonkers, and you can't believe you're in the middle of the city except when you see the skyscrapers over your shoulder. That's his planting plan there. Again, this incredibly dynamic landscape style. They picked him because they wanted to emulate these prairies, these Midwestern prairies. And so, they went from, these scenes in the 60s to the scenes at the bottom, in the 21st century. And you get a sense of this sort of incredibly intricate, flowing, one plant flowing into the next. You can't see a piece of dirt. Okay? If you are maintaining this garden, it's a pain in the butt. It is so because you have to deal with this idea that the plants are going to move and you can't keep them in their places. And they are going to find the places that they want. So you have to, and there's hundreds of species in here. So you have to, as a horticulturist, you have to know what each one of those species looks like when it's this big. So you don't go through there and just weed out something that might be this beautiful serendipitous Mother Nature telling you where something should be. So I think that this project, with this design intent of bringing a piece of these wet meadow Midwestern prairies into the heart of Chicago, that picture to me just says it all. It gives you a sense of ease when you were in this garden. When I'm in the midst of 80-story skyscrapers, and I've got this little space to walk between the 80-story skyscraper and the street, I don't really feel all that comfortable. I'm not a city guy to begin with, but when I'm in a space like this, I can look around and I can actually appreciate the artistry in the architecture of the city from a place where I feel much more grounded. So I feel like that project and the designers really hit a home run as far as that goes. Okay, next project. So this is another fascinating one with a lot of layers, some of them tricky, tied to the history of the city. When I was the executive director of the Columbus Botanical Garden, I kind of inherited a master plan that some parts were good, some parts were not so good. And I was responsible for tweaking the master plan and then building it. So this was about $1 million, 1 acre, $1 acre, $1 million garden. That's a lot of money. And making it happen was an interesting experience because we realized, one of the first things we realized is, as a fundraiser, as an executive director of a nonprofit, one of the things you were intimately involved with, as some of you may be aware, is how much money do we have, and oops, we don't have enough money. And where are we going to save money? How are we going to save money in doing this? And so I had a historic relationship with the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. They were very interested in getting Georgia native species out into landscapes. I knew this, so I actually contracted them to grow all the species for the Georgia native perennial garden you're looking at here to save us about $20,000. And again, our design intent for this space was to use the design to tell the story of the natural and cultural history of Columbus and Southwest Georgia. The materiality was fascinating. We're going to talk about that. The constraints were fascinating. It's a long. If I had been involved in the master plan from the beginning, we would have never done this. And I know it's irritating when you hear people go, "I would have never have done that because I'm so smart." It's just one of these things that I hate it when people say that, but here I am saying it. It's just one of these weird things. Is why would you build a long, skinny garden on a hillside that runs down the hill? What do? The only option you have is to turn it into terraces. And you remember the partie that I showed you in the beginning with the path going like this and the long rectangle? That's this garden. You'll see that partie. So fascinating constraints, fascinating cultural history, really interesting opportunity for interesting materiality. This project has the most interesting materiality of all of them. And this was interesting for me because this was when I decided I was working with studio outside. That's a landscape architecture firm in Dallas, Texas. And so I was their client. And I was the project manager. So I wasn't strictly speaking the designer on this project, but it was my chance to engage with a landscape designer, a globally known landscape designer, and to kind of push them maybe past their comfort level as far as how involved their clients typically are. And so, but they were awesome. Like Ellen Castley, who's an architect in Durham, you know, she features in one of the other case studies here. You know, whenever I've worked with people who are famous, locally, regionally, globally, I'm usually very pleasantly surprised how actually down to earth they are and willing to listen. If you as a client say, hey, you need to listen to me. I understand that you could probably do this all without me, but the end product of that is not going to be as good as if you have a client that's really engaged with the process. So, the cultural history of Columbus. So I moved to Georgia. I mean, it was a like culture shock to me. I say I'm from the South, but I'm not from the South. This is South Georgia. It was an entirely different world. The city of Columbus is essentially, I don't mean this, this may sound like I'm criticizing the way that Columbus has grown, but it's one of these weird things like, okay, imagine that like the Dukes. So the Duke family was very important in the development of Durham from the 20s to the 50s and 60s or whatever. They put a lot of money into the city. They built whole neighborhoods. They owned huge parts of the city. Now Duke still owns huge parts of the city, but it's not the Duke family that owns it. The families that built and owned Columbus, they still own it. Like huge tracts of land, real estate are still owned by the same families that owned them 200 years ago. So that was a very, very different experience for me, going into a situation where I was speaking, it was a little bit like I was speaking to royalty. And so there was a certain way I had to act as somebody who was going around asking for money, which these wealthy families get all the time. But it was a very different vibe. And what you're looking at is downtown Columbus. And Columbus was built on mills. Textile mills, grist mills. What you're looking at there is the Eagle and Phoenix mills and the Columbus Iron Works. And so if anybody here ever lived in like a town with a river flowing through it? So it's really cool. But it's not as cool if the river is just dammed every mile, which is what Columbus was. And so one of the most fascinating story for me to wrap my brain around working at the Columbus Botanical Garden was the history of the city and its relationship with the river. Okay, so the river became an absolutely fundamental part of our design of this space. And here you see the river as it exists today. It's actually a whitewater. It's a place where people go whitewater rafting down through the middle of the city. It didn't used to be like that. This is what it used to be. There used to be mills all down the river. The Bibb Company, textile mill, City Mills, grist mill, Muskogee Mills, textile, Eagle and Phoenix Mills, textile, Columbus Iron Works, foundry. Columbus Iron Works was actually commandeered by the Confederate government during the Civil War, and they made cannons for the Confederacy in that mill. So it's a very layered, complicated history of the people and the place. So me coming to grips with all that, again, and also with this other interesting layer of I'm dealing with these old families that are like royalty in the city. That was a fascinating learning curve for me as a designer. But when I started to understand the idea of the river as being a core of what we could access as far as our design, I started to understand, well, what are some of the stories about the river? And any of you are familiar with William Bartram? Anybody know that name?
Yeah.
So William Bartram, William Bartram's dad, John Bartram, started Bartram's Gardens, the oldest botanical garden in the country, in Philadelphia. And it was a nursery. And John Bartram grew native species and sent them all over the world, because back in the day, everybody in Europe wanted everything that we had here. So that was John Bartram's job. And William was searching for what he was supposed to be in the world. And one of the things that William was, and probably a lot of guys back in the day were all Renaissance men. He was a great writer. He was a great botanical and zoological artist. And it turns out that he was a really intrepid traveler. So he traveled all over the South and writing about what he saw during a time when this would have been a little bit to him like the Wild West. He would have been hanging out with the Cherokee in their longhouses. He would have been experiencing a very unadulterated natural world in many ways, and he wrote about it in Bartram's Travels. And the reason I have this little picture here is that if you want to see an absolutely fantastic coffee table book, this guy, Philip Juras, you want to talk about feeling insecure? So this guy, Philip Juras, he's a landscape architect. He got a degree in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia. But not only is he a landscape architect, but he's also like an absolutely bonkers painter. So he went out and he went to all these places that William Bartram would have seen, and he painted the landscape as Bartram would have seen it. And it's just it's awesome. It's an awesome book. He's amazing. I wish I was as amazing as him. But again, complicated history. So July 1775, William Bartram crosses the Chattahoochee at Coweta Town, which is a Creek village, Native American village. And there was an extensive Creek settlement in this part of the state. This would have been, 1775. And Bartram was one of the first people to really kind of write about not only the natural beauty, but also the cultures that he experienced. Now, that's 1775 that he would have been staying with the Creeks in Coweta. In the span of 25 years, the Creeks had been essentially extirpated from this entire part of the state. Their chief, there was a battle between two chiefs, Manawa and Chief William McIntosh. That's an interesting name for a chief. He was half blood, but McIntosh saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the white people were going to do everything they could by hook or crook to push the Creeks out, so he wanted to accept a land deal to move them out west. Manawa said hell no, and essentially started a civil war, a small mini civil war in Coweta Town. That didn't go well for them, as none of these struggles did for the native cultures. And then within 20 years, the Creeks were entirely gone from this part. And then the white settlers came in, and they dammed the river, they built their mills, and entirely transformed, for better or worse, what Columbus was. And but from that time, this is a quote that William Bartram wrote about his crossing of the Chattahoochee in Coweta, which is now Columbus. The land rises from the river with sublime magnificence, gradually retreating by flights or steps, one behind and above the other, in beautiful theatrical order, each step or terrace holding up a level plain. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You don't need me to do that for you, but he's quite flowery, quite descriptive. I'm not sure if it actually really looked like that, but that's how William Bartram wrote. But here we have an example of what the experience was like to be on the Chattahoochee River in 1775. So again, that was another nugget for me that I wanted to reference to bring our brains back to that time when we were visitors at the garden. So we commissioned a stonemason to carve a coping that would go around a pool in the middle of this perennial garden. And the perennial garden was styled, a stylistic interpretation of the Chattahoochee River. The Bartram quote flowed around the pool. which the pool flowed. And then materiality. So this stone is gneiss, not like nice like N-I-C-E, this G-N-E-I-S-S, gneiss, that's the geology. And there was a southern living village that was 2 miles from our botanical garden. I say a southern living village, it was designed by somebody associated with Southern Living. And they dug up tons and tons and literally tons and tons and tons of rock. And so I said, oh, wow, like if I wanted to tell the story, if I want to really ground my design, I would love to use some of this rock, and it's gorgeous. It's got veins of quartz, pink, white, running all through it. There's these beautiful dapplings. So we use that gneiss stone all over the site. Again, the ability to kind of put your hand on a stone and to explain exactly where it came from and what its history is a very powerful thing versus designing with whatever you can find at Home Depot. Nothing against Home Depot, but I love to have stories to tell, when it comes to that. And then if we go back to the river, at one point in the early days of damming the river, they built these what are called crib dams. So literally it's like a little crib. It's like a little wooden crib filled with rocks. And they would have taken all those rocks that you just saw that I took from that Southern Living Village, and they would have filled these dams full of them to keep the dams from floating away, because essentially all they are is wooden boxes. So these crib dams, when they blew up, literally they blew up the dams with dynamite to let the river go and turn it into a whitewater site. And what they did was they uncovered all these old dams made out of longleaf pine timbers. And so they had been underwater for early 1800s. So they've been underwater for 170 years, 180 years, still intact. So when I heard that, and then I heard that somebody actually had some that we could get, I was like, oh my gosh, if we could put our hands on, literally get our hands on and sit on, some of these old timbers from the dams along Chattahoochee. There you see all the old nails sticking out that would have held the timbers together. Could we get our hands on some of these and actually use them in the landscape? And so there's a picture that you can see of that particular design intent diatribe that I just went on, kind of made manifest. The coping, the nice coping around the moving pool that's meant to emulate the Chattahoochee, the quote about the Chattahoochee back in the 1700s, and then those timbers turned into benches. And then the final piece of the puzzle was the plant collection, and that's the plant collection that we got from the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. They grew all those plants for us, sold them to us for a song, and that was my little attempt at being Pete Outhoff, putting together the planting plan for the perennial garden. So again, you can see a little bit of what I'm attempting to do here is to not just tie elements from my story, but tie elements from design stories together from different sites. There's an attempt at a party. There's that party that you saw from the beginning. All right. So, again, every one of these studies is shrinking. The size is shrinking. We went from 1,500 acres to 2.5 acres at the Lurie Garden to 1 acre in Columbus. Now we're at half an acre at the Blomquist Garden at Duke University, where Kavan and I work together. So this was a prairie project that a team of folks and I worked on together. One of my stalwart companions on that particular journey was Annabelle Rennick, PhD plant botanist, who I kind of turned loose on the plant collection for this prairie because at the time I was working on another project that you're going to see next, the next to last project that we're going to talk about. But that's the end product. But this was the design intent. Use design to tell the story of the vanishing Piedmont prairie landscape. What are our constraints? Really lousy, urban, eroded soil. Duke Gardens was like a dump, for years and years and years. It was a dump, literally. Like it was a dump. People would dump trash there. But its opportunities, high visitation, and what are some of the pieces, the patterns of the puzzle that we wanted to make sure that we used as part of our story? Natural history of the Piedmont Prairie, Native American landscape influence. What does that remind you of the story that we talked about with the Tuscarora and New Bern? So the Piedmont Prairie is a vanishing ecosystem. And why is it vanishing? Well, it's vanishing for the exact same reasons that the longleaf ecosystem has been vanishing for decades. It's because of the habitat loss, but really fire suppression. The Piedmont Prairie ecosystem is a fire-dependent ecosystem, and it's fire-dependent for a number of reasons. Fire, as it moves through the landscape, it enriches the soil. It essentially turns that organic material into fertilizer for the next generation, and it also removes woody vegetation. Like what happens if we like imagine that you have your yard and you just move away for 10 years. What do you think you're going to find when you come back and you look at your yard? It's going to be full of trees. The trees are going to move in. And that's what happens everywhere, that the Piedmont Prairie ecosystems used to exist in the state of North Carolina, because by and large, they were managed and supported by cultures like the Saponi and the Occaneechi in this part of the state. And because they recognized, just as the Tuscarora did, when you have landscapes that are dominated by grasses and herbaceous species that attract bison, yes, elk, yes, deer, turkey, you want more of that. And so you would have managed that landscape in the same way that fire did, naturally, to encourage it. So when we were thinking about, when we came across this idea of could we emulate architecturally or landscape architecturally this idea of this vanishing ecosystem, could we interpret it? Well, what do you do if you're trying to do something you've never done before? You try to find people who've done it. So you've got people like Pete Aldolf, the dynamic landscape designer, but this was really not necessarily up his alley. Pete Aldolf doesn't do landscape restoration in that way, but Aldo Leopold did at the Curtis Prairie at UW-Madison. Anybody ever been to Curtis Prairie before? It's really cool. I like that. I volunteered there when my wife was I came into contact with it when my wife was an undergrad at UW studying dance. I volunteered at the Curtis Prairie at UW and really that was kind of the beginning of this idea of an association with the Midwestern prairies. But who thinks that there are not prairies in North Carolina? Well, there were, and it's all about geology. So on the left, you see these green bands. This is a type of soil called alpha soils that are all over the place in the Midwest, everywhere. But they're little dotted, scattered collections of these soil types throughout the southeastern Piedmont. And it's in these little pockets where we would have had millions and millions of acres of that Piedmont Prairie that you saw on that power line cut off. And then I'm going to go over here. And then so on the right-hand slide is just a little Photoshop interpretation of how that plays out. That lighter kind of amoeba, that's the Piedmont region. And then those darker blotches are these soils that support prairie species. And when I say soils that support prairie species, what I mean is the soils that don't do so good job supporting other species because they're hard, they're very difficult to grow in, et cetera, et cetera. Now, architecture. Architecture is really important. I was a carpenter for a long time. I love the integration of architecture and landscape. So we wanted to have a classroom in this site. And Kavana was actually a great resource throughout both the design but also the usage of the classroom that eventually got built. But that picture on the left-hand side, any of you know Ellen Casserly? Yeah, so she's awesome. She's an architect in Durham. She's done some really amazing work, residentially, industrially, things like that in Durham. she came out, and I told her I wanted a classroom, and she came out, and I kind of did my little design intent thing. Like I said, I'm imagining a building that has a farm vernacular vibe up there, and in between me and it are these flowing grasses. So she went jump, 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 like right then. And she drew that little sketch. And then she was my architect after that. Like, you know what I'm talking about. And this was a little kind of like artsy-fartsy interpretation that I did on my own, kind of like the vibe that I wanted to create. These were some of the architectural precedents that I really liked. Anybody familiar with Fay Jones? So Fay Jones is an architect. And Fay Jones has designed some of the most iconic outdoor structures that exist, period, or that are relevant if you are a designer who really loves the integration of architecture in the natural world. So this is the Pine Coat Pavilion up there in the top right. That's the Pine Coat Pavilion at the Crosby Arboretum. And one of Fay Jones's strengths was this idea of designing buildings that feel almost a little bit like they're not there, like you're actually in a building that is a forest. Is the forest the building? Is the building the forest? Where do the two end and begin? On the right-hand side, again, that was a building that I really loved at Shangri-La Botanical Gardens, designed by Lake Plato. And so those two were the architectural precedents, but really what I was after was this in the bottom right. Basically a tobacco barn. I wanted this to feel as if it was an open building, but you couldn't mistake kind of the very strong utilitarian inheritance of the architectural vernacular from like a pole barn, essentially, is what we were working for. So this is the structure that Ellen designed for us. It's actually since evolved a little bit more. Annabelle, who is now who I was, has taken it even a little bit further. But it really does what we wanted it to do, and it met the design intent. And a cool thing is that one of the design intent goals that we set was that this building would have the smallest environmental footprint we could have. And so one way to do that is to not buy any materials from anybody and have them shipped to you or anything. Well, how do you build something if you don't buy any materials? Well, there were loblolly pines dotted throughout this area that we turned into a prairie. So when we took them down, which we had to do to build the prairie, we milled them and we built a building out of them. And that screen that you see on the left was from dead standing cedar trees from Duke Forest. So again, there's a real strong relationship between the place and the materials. The materiality is as important. It's not just a throwaway, what you build something out of. And then there's John Lawson again. Remember the guy that met Horrible End? Well, this is 10 years before that. So he doesn't know what's about to happen to him. But John Lawson and his voyage to Carolina country was a fascinating story. He was the king's surveyor in North Carolina, but he was also a writer, and he loved to travel. And so he wrote this interesting account of traveling through one of these areas where the Piedmont prairies would have existed and would have been maintained by the Saponis and the Occaneechees. He wrote this fascinating account in his voyage. I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry. We traveled this day about 25 miles over pleasant savanna ground, high and dry, having very few trees upon it, and those standing at great distance. So can you imagine? This is near Salisbury. So this would have been near Salisbury, Charlotte area. Can you imagine riding a horse for 25 miles and just seeing nothing but flowing grasses? I mean, that's what it looked like. Because the Saponis, who were the tribe that he mainly came into contact with, they were burning, on 2-3 year rotations to maintain that landscape. And this is his map of his travels. This is the Occaneechee path. So this was the Native American trading path. between the Okanichis, their headquarters up here in Virginia, the Catawbas down here near Rock Hill, South Carolina, and beyond. And you can see that from about Hillsborough to Charlotte, he essentially followed that trading path, because if there's a road, why would you use it? So he would have encountered a lot of Native Americans along the way as he made this trip in 1701, 10 years before his painful demise. Take it from me. And so that's our prairie. That's a view from it. I think it's second year of. And so you remember that Pete Aldolf. I'm not saying this looks like a Pete Aldolf landscape, but it's a dynamic landscape where the plants are meant to kind of co-inhabit very, very intimately. You don't see a speck of ground. It's habitat at the ground level for voles and moles and snakes and toads and all sorts of cool stuff like that. This is a cool aerial shot of that prairie site. And that's kind of a little prairie party. It just kind of breaks down, kind of what we did and what it looked like and what shape it was and how it was arranged. Okay, so almost done here. Okay, so like I mentioned, I was a carpenter. I really love building things. Mostly what I did in my carpenter days, I was a framing carpenter. So for instance, if you hear the phrase like close enough for government work, well, framing carpentry is kind of like that. But I was fascinated by what the trim carpenters did, the detail guys that would come in after us and make everything so beautiful. And I wanted to learn more and more about how that was done. And one of the ways I did it was when I had the chance to work at Duke Gardens, I would bring contractors like that in to build really cool stuff for us. So what I'm going to talk about here briefly is bridge design. The design process of building a bridge. So this is a bridge that we built at Duke Gardens, and we're going to go through, the design intent behind why we got to that place. But, let's look at patterns here. So for me, the arts and crafts movement, modernist architecture, and the Civilian Conservation Corps bridge precedents were kind of my inspirations for why we did this, and you'll kind of see a little bit. But here's a shot from the 30s of Duke Gardens when it was just an iris garden. And here we've got a bridge. Bridges are all over the place in Duke Gardens because, again, it was like a dump and it was a valley and water moved through it. And this garden actually washed away, in a big rainstorm. So a designer might have been able to tell you, like if you look at the topography, in a heavy rain, all this water's got to go somewhere. So literally the garden washed away. And you'll see the Duke Chapel there in the background. But the modern iteration of Duke Gardens it's kind of like, I used to joke with my other curators, it's kind of like an artistic arms race. Because the garden is broken up into essentially four thematic areas, each one run by a curator, kind of our own little fiefdom. And we're kind of always trying to outdo the other as far as what we do. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. There's nothing like having a room full of really talented designers because you're pushing each other. So you can't just build a bridge at Duke Gardens. You can't just build like a way to go from like this side of the creek to the other side of the creek. It's got to be a work of art. And I'm so PO'd, and you can tell Paul this, come on, that when you look up Duke Gardens bridges, like this is like the only one that shows up. The red bridge. I mean, anyway, I love Paul. Paul Jones is one of my curator. He was one of my curator guys. He's still there. He's a genius. But when you look up bridges in Duke Gardens, 99.9% of them are this one, this iconic red bridge, because it is fantastic. But there are a lot of other ones, and every one of them, this is just a little selection of them. Every one of them is in its own way a work of art and representative of where it is, why it is, and what it is. So for me, when I got into the bridge design world at Duke Gardens, I knew that stakes were going to get raised here, so we better have some good precedents. So anybody Frank Lloyd Wright fan? Yeah, I love Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. I mean, it's funny, when you go to Falling Water and you walk around in there, which is that's Falling Water, his iconic house that he designed. It feels a little bit like he was designing it for people that were like a lot shorter than the normal person was. But I asked people that, and he said because he wanted to make you mindful of traveling through the house and the compression and entering and exiting different places. But these two books were kind of when we start to, again, that phrase, wrap your brain around it. When we begin to wrap our brain around designing a bridge in Duke Gardens, what were our fundamental underpinnings of our design? So on the left, this is an incredible compendium of all the park and recreation structures that were built during the Civilian Conservation Corps era. I think it is one of the most impressive, creative, inspirational periods of landscape architecture in American history. And I bought that book. It's like this thick. It's the Bible of structure design if you like that thematic era. And then on the other side, the reason I have this book in there is because that's a Frank Lloyd Wright stained glass pattern. And that, I saw that, I knew Frank Lloyd Wright, I knew I wanted to integrate the Civilian Conservation Corps era and Frank Lloyd Wright, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it until I saw that stained glass window. So his patterns, his stained glass patterns, were the inspiration for this particular bridge. And you'll see a little bit of them. These are some early sketches. That's an early sketch of kind of trying to imagine, because when you build a bridge, you don't want people to fall off, so you got to have railings. But what's more boring than just like a picket and rail, kind of thing? So how can you be creative? Well, how can we make a stained glass window out of metal where essentially most of those spaces are empty, but you have enough of these little dark spaces in here to emulate that stained glass pattern. And we're in a botanical garden. So like the goal of any designer should be, and I say this all the time, is that whatever you design shouldn't be able to exist anywhere else. And what I mean by that is that it is a combination of you, the designer, the other people that you're working with, if it's a client, them, if it's just family members, them, all of these inputs, what you like, what you don't like, all of these things should go together to make something that can't exist anywhere else. And so, we're a botanical garden, so we said, well, how can we integrate botany into the design? So this is a little cardboard cutout of a resurrection fern laid out on the floor of my office when I started taking, what's that? Yeah, we're good. When we started taking, getting inspirations, in the upper right-hand side, you'll see that was the final panel where we started to integrate this idea of the botanical in there. These were some of the Civilian Conservation Corps presidents from that era, from that book. You'll see little notes from my curator friends, the ones they liked, the ones they didn't like. I love these little pictures because it reminds me of working with that team. And that's kind of a picture of how the bridge, how that one side of that bridge turned out, where you have that sort of essentially using that stained glass motif to begin with. All right. We designed two bridges when we were there. This one was a little different. This one was inaccessible. So when I say inaccessible, I mean that if you were in a wheelchair, a walker, if you weren't perfectly physically able, this bridge on the left was very difficult because it was and they had put cleats in there over time to make it so it was easier to walk on, but it was not accessible. So our first kind of consideration was, well, we got to flatten it out. Okay, but if we flatten it out, can we get that same sort of like little arch feeling in it? The one on the right is what we eventually came up with. But this bridge was basically, this was the whole thing, is that in that little area where the bridge was built, was the resurrection fern that you saw a picture of, a cardboard cutout. And then if you've ever been to Duke, you know that these Gothic arches are everywhere. And how can we, that was a real simple little sketch that I did, how can we integrate the Gothic arch as into the botany of the garden? So again, the railing has to be part of the work of art. So we had a really talented metal worker who also did the other bridge, Storybook Metal Shop near Pittsburgh and outside of Chapel Hill. They crafted a really, really great interpretation, and there's the finished bridge there. Okay, so this is a weird project. This is it. We're basically done. This is a really weird project for me because I don't know. I had been doing this for a long time, and I can be a little bit of a snob in terms of like kind of what I want to work on. Things have to interest me. But Mark Huff, who was the campus landscape architect at Duke, knew Jill, the woman who owned this house. Jill works at Duke Hospital. And Jill got in touch with me, and she was so earnest. She said, I've got this tiny backyard, and it's wet, and we've got this crazy poodle with all this energy, and how can we transform this space? And immediately my red flags are going off. So I do not design for poodles. Like a little snob flags. I don't want to do poodle design. And then I went to the site, and again, of course, here's a little bit of the design intent. Improve the client quality of life through design and construction of a renovated backyard. So that's the most important thing to remember about this project itself. And so I went there, and I'm like, man, all these houses are exactly the same. Like, this is like landscape architecture hell. Like, why would you want to work in this area? You look at the topography. There's 10 feet, and this is the site I was working in the back, very back of the yard. There's 10 feet elevation difference between here and here. All the water is running right back to that backyard. It's like a freaking swamp back there. You can see 2-foot contours. We get back here, we're 10 feet lower than we are here. So this had all the makings of a disaster as far as the design. But what made it not a disaster were the clients. They were, I said, okay, I'll come and we'll talk about this. And again, I apologize if I sound like a snob, but like at this point in my career, literally I've been doing this for 30 years, like I want to be interested in what I'm doing. But the funny thing was, it turned out that the people were the interesting thing about this. They were so earnest in how dissatisfied they were with the condition of their life as it related to their outdoor environment. They wanted so desperately to have an outdoor space where they could gather with friends and family, and where that annoying little poodle who hated me could have a little refuge. But it was how earnest they were, and how excited they were, and how honest they were with me about their budget. This is perhaps frustrating for landscape designers. Oftentimes we'll be like, well, how much money do you have to spend? And they say, we don't know. Okay, I may design something that you can't afford if you can't have any idea how much. They were very honest about their budget. We worked with their budget. And basically kind of what it came down to is they wanted a series of decks, and they wanted a place for Henry to play. And the other kicker with this is that the only way we were going to have a place for Henry to play in the backyard was if we made it from artificial turf. I've never in my life ever used artificial turf in a landscape. I was like, oh, but this is the thing about design. If you're diligent, you will be led to the truth. Okay? And the truth was that was the solution. And they didn't like to garden. The house was crazy. They didn't like to garden. They didn't want to garden. But they were so honest about it and so vulnerable about it that I just really loved the process. And it really kind of made for a fantastic, when I realized that, okay, a series of decks and an artificial turf dog run are what we're doing. But I liked them so much that we came up with a design to illustrate that. And that's what we built. We built this raised dog run where Henry could hang out and would never be wet. And then we built these 2-tiered decks so that they could entertain. And it went from that to that you see on the right. And again, my purpose of being here isn't to say, look at my great projects, aren't I a great landscape architect? This was such an aberration for me. This was such a different process for me. But what made it so special, I talk about observation, the first slide, and how powerful observation is. And observation, you don't just use your eyes, you also use your ears to observe. And the clients were so earnest and so honest. And I have never, that little quote at the end, and again, Henry hated me. He couldn't say it. But hi, Stefan, your work in the backyard has changed our lives. We are back here every day, morning, noon, and night. Henry is in heaven, and so are we. That project, that to me, initially, seemed like just a throwaway. Why would I want to design a dog run in a cookie cutter neighborhood? Was opened my eyes that it really isn't about the project or the style of project. It's about the relationship that you have with the people you're working with, and do you have the attention to get from when you know nothing to when you really understand what needs to happen there. So that's it. Thank you. 11:59. Wow, look at, it just turned off. So